Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 145, J.R. Saxby. I came across a newspaper article from 1878 reporting that an ex-schoolmaster had attempted to kill his wife and commit suicide. This man was Jonathon Richard Saxby. What led to such an extreme act? Jonathon Richard Saxby was born in Harwich, Essex, England on the 14th of February 1830. He was the son of Isaac Fort Saxby and Judith Love. Isaac Saxby was a mariner who had fought in the Crimean War in 1845 and rose to the rank of captain. Upon his retirement from the sea, he was a counsellor, so Jonathan's father seemed to be a very respectable citizen. Jonathan was the seventh child of 9, one of 2 of the family who came to Australia. Jonathon Saxby married Jane Cannell at St John's Church at Old Haymarket, Liverpool, England, on the 7th of March 1850, when he was 20 and Jane 23. Jane was recorded as being a cook for John Gardner in Everton, Lancashire, England in 1851. Jonathan was the third mate on the Schomberg on its maiden voyage. It left Liverpool on the 6th of October 1855, and on the 26th of December 1855, the ship ran aground at Peterborough, Victoria, southeast of Warrnambool. The ship was nearing the end of her voyage and closing in shore off Cape Otway to Curtis Inlet, now called Schomberg Reef, east of Peterborough and 150 miles west of Melbourne. The wind suddenly dropped and the ship drifted into an uncharted reef and became stuck fast. There was no loss of life. All the passengers, the crew and the mail were taken off by a passing coastal steamer, the Queen, that was out of Port Fairy, and the following morning were taken to Port Phillip. Jonathan was the officer of the watch when the incident occurred. He tried in vain to alert the captain to the danger. It was said that he had been below deck playing cards with 2 ladies, one of them Miss Hart, an 18-year-old passenger. When the mate, Jonathon Luxby, came down and reported that the ship was getting rather close in under land and suggested going about, Forbes was losing and, being a bit out of temper, insisted on playing another rubber before tacking ship, and the danger point had been overstripped when at 11 o'clock he came on deck and gave the order to bout ship. In the subsequent trial, Captain James Forbes was charged with gross negligence and for wrecking the ship. The captain was cleared as the sandbank was uncharted and there wasn't enough evidence to show that he had not used every precaution necessary to save his ship. There was public outrage. There was a mass meeting of the passengers that was held in Melbourne at the Mechanics Institute on the 3rd of February 1856, and Forbes was severely censured, and some went so far as to suggest that he was so disgusted at the slowness of the passage that he let the ship go ashore on purpose. When Forbes was told that the ship was hard aground, he is reported to have said, "Let her go to hell," and immediately went below. Henry Keane, the first mate, took charge, clewed up the sails, dropped the anchor and lowered the boats. It was mainly due to the first mate and a first-class passenger that all of the passengers were safely disembarked and put aboard on the Queen. It is not known whether Jane was aboard the ship along with her husband. Wives of officers were sometimes allowed to travel with their husbands, but were not recorded on the ship's muster, so if she was aboard, there's no documentary evidence of this. I found no mention in shipping records of Jane as a passenger on any vessel arriving in Australia. However, Jane's death certificate states that she'd lived in Victoria, making her arrival 1856, which coincided with the Schomberg's voyage. Based on headstone information of Jane and Jonathan's grave, they had the following children: Albert Edward, born in 1857, that died at the age of 2 at Sandridge, Victoria, now known as Port Melbourne. Jane, born on the 25th of February 1859 at Sandridge. Christina, whose birth and death is recorded in Melbourne in 1859. Thomas Saxby, born and died in 1860. Isaac, born on the 19th of August 1860, who died on the 22nd of March 1861. aged only 7 months old, of marasmus, so protein malnutrition, and mesenteric disease, so an intestinal disease. Jonathon continued his occupation as a mariner until 1861, when he was listed as a stevedore, that is, loading and unloading ships. So then their sixth child, Julia Margaret, was born on the 29th of June 1862 at Sandridge, and then their seventh child, Albert Edward, born on the 18th of December 1863 at Sandridge, who died on the 3rd of March 1865 at 14 months old of diarrhoea at Sandridge. They lived at Railway Place in a 3-bedroom timber cottage in 1863, and Jonathon was working as a labourer. On the 11th of July 1866, their eighth child, Elizabeth Louisa, was born in Sandridge. Based on the information given on the children's birth certificates, there was another female, Elizabeth, who was stated as deceased in 1860, and there's also another female and male deceased in 1860, but I haven't found a register of that. The inconsistencies in the listings of the births are also puzzling. It should be noted that Richard Saxby is somewhat an unreliable informant. When he remarried in February 1875, he gave Jane's death date as March 1873, when it was actually October. He also gave his age as 38 when he was actually 45. His birth date calculates from the ages he claims to be at the births of his other children. Could have been anywhere between 1825 and 1832. When he died in 1891, his age was actually 72, so older than what his birth records indicate, giving him a birth year of 1819. He was in fact born on the 14th of February 1830. So based on the above records, it seems that only 3 children survived into adulthood from the 8, Jane, Julia and Elizabeth Louisa. In 1867, Jonathon changed his occupation to be a teacher, and by 1872 he was a schoolmaster. An advertisement says, "This day at Sandridge at 3 o'clock, on the ground at Railway Place, opposite the Cosmopolitan Hotel, school dwelling and land. Mr. Jonathon Richard Saxby, who is compelled through failing eyesight to relinquish his school, to be sold by public auction. The school, the dwelling and the land. The building contains the 4 good rooms, an allotment of land, and this property is situated in a thickly populated neighbourhood, is well worth the attention of those in search of a snug little property." Jane Saxby died on the 28th of October 1873 at the age of 45 from cirrhosis. Jonathon stated he was a schoolmaster at Sandridge at the time his wife died. On the 6th of February 1875, Jonathon married Mary Robina Jennings. Mary was 27 years younger than Jonathon when they married. She was only 17. He was 44. Mary had in fact been married to George Knott, who used the name George Harbin, his middle name on the marriage certificate, but used her maiden name when marrying Jonathon, so committing bigamy. Jonathon continued his profession until February 1874, when he was recorded as working as a watchman by December of that year. They had a daughter, Mabel, born in 1876 in Sandridge, but she died in 1878, aged 18 months. On the 16th of October 1878, following a failed murder-suicide, Saxby was convicted for the attempted murder of Mary Robina Saxby and sentenced to 4 years at Pentridge. On the 19th of September 1878, it's recorded in the paper as the Saxby case. At the police court today, Jonathon Saxby was brought up on remand charged with the attempted murder of his wife. The following letter referred to by Mrs. Saxby when giving her evidence on Thursday was put on exhibit. Jonathon had written this letter in the hope that he would have killed his wife and killed himself at this point. To the coroner of the City of Melbourne, "Sir, I trust this may save you, with many of the medical staff, the trouble of finding out my state of mind. I wish to inform you, cool, calm and deliberate, my work of vengeance is done. I was married to the one I loved 3 years ago. She, Robina Jennings, maiden name, was a servant with a tobacco merchant in Melbourne, and she fell pregnant by him. He concocted a marriage with her. He, the groom, married her in a wrong name. After being with him a short time, he so ill-used her that she had to get a protection order against him. She then became my housekeeper. I married her since that time. I have been hunted by her own brothers and sisters like a mad dog. They twice parted us and drove her on the streets of Melbourne at last. She has a sister living in Richmond and a brother living in Stoke Street, Sandridge. They I blame for all her trouble. She has property coming to her and they are trying to make her commit herself so they can do her out of it. She is now with another and deserted me. This, I may state, is our own compact sworn on the Bible. The one who betrayed the other, that one should die and the other destroy theirself. That has come to my turn to do so. This is caused by Frank and his sister Bessie. Murder and suicide. God curse them. Amen. Could I but see her, this might be stopped, but no, I cannot. To all to whom this may concern, think not for one moment that I am deranged. I assure you I am cool and collected as I never was, and I pray the Almighty God may forgive this rash set. Give all and everything I leave to my daughter, Lizzie Saxby. J.K. Saxby of Stoke Street, Sandridge, 6th of July. William Ferris deposed that on the 18th he and another man were informed of a disturbance going on in the house in which the prosecutrix lived. They went in and saw the prisoner struggling with his wife in the passage and attempting to stab her with a penknife. The prisoner had his throat cut. Further evidence of the corroborative nature has been given and the bench committed the prisoner for trial. And on the 9th of September 1878, the Saxby case to the editor of the Argus. Sir, I do not know that one is justified in taking account of the ravings of a disordered mind. Though this man Saxby accuses me of immorality some years ago, I had never heard of his existence till I read the account of the recent tragedy in the press, and there is certainly no foundation to his statement. The woman had been intimate with the groom, he acknowledged it, and married her. Shortly after their marriage, they dropped out of my sight and knowledge. A man like Saxby, who will, as a matter of course, be shortly confined either to the madhouse or the jail, cannot be made responsible for his statement, and even if he were to be set free, what can be done to a man, according to the press, has descended through drunkenness to the meanest condition of life. It is a pity that such a letter found publication, for though coming from a source it could not fail to give annoyance, and perhaps inflicting a certain amount of injury upon the many persons referred to in it. Yours, the employer of the woman. On the 19th of August 1878, attempted murder and suicide. Some excitement was caused in West Melbourne yesterday when it became known that a double tragedy had been enacted in Franklin Street West. From the facts that could be gathered, it appears that about 10 days ago, a young married woman named Mary Robina Saxby engaged apartments at a furnished house at Charleston Buildings, Franklin Street West, kept by an old lady called Mrs. Blinco, and was accompanied by a child of 4 years of age, the offspring of a former marriage by her husband, Jonathon Saxby, a man about 50. Since she had been living there, her husband has been frequenting the place, and appears he had a desire to obtain possession of the child, but his wife refused to give the child up. Saxby visited the house on Wednesday last, but he found that his wife and child were not at home. He entered the place, and meeting a Mrs. Noble, who with a younger sister also occupies the apartments in the house, Saxby asked Mrs. Noble to let him have the child. He was told they had instructions not to allow the child to be taken from the house by Saxby. He then drew a knife and addressed Mrs. Noble in a very menacing manner, vowing that no person should stand between him and his child. He then became calmer and left the place. Mrs. Noble gave information to the police concerning the man's conduct, but although he visited the place once or twice again, there was nothing unusual in his manner, and he appeared to be on friendly terms with his wife. Shortly after 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, he called at the house, and his wife opened the door for him. He entered into conversation with his wife, and about a quarter of an hour afterwards a knock was heard at the front door. Mrs. Noble's sister, who was in the house at the time, noticed that Mrs. Saxby was engaged in reading a letter to her husband. She did not interrupt them and went to answer the door. She went outside onto the veranda, and Saxby, without any warning, slammed the door and shut the girl out. Immediately afterwards she heard a scuffle in the room. Mrs. Saxby at the same time was screaming murder and help. The girl at once ran for the policeman but could not find one for 10 minutes. On returning, she found the place had been entered by some neighbours next door. As the girl was running for help, she met a young man named Ferris, who lodges next door, and told him that a murder had been committed in her house. Ferris hastened home, and meeting a fellow lodger named John Kelly, he spoke to him on the matter. Kelly stated that he just heard a woman screaming for help in Mrs. Blinco's house, and on going to the front door he found it locked. He hastened round to the back and found that it was also locked. Returning again to the front of the house, he burst open the window, heard scuffling in the passage, and the door leading from the room being locked, he was unable to gain entrance to the passage, and he again went around to the back gate. He then met Mrs. Blinco coming out of the gate in a state of excitement, and without any hesitation he rushed into the house and observed the man Saxby in the passage with one arm around his wife's neck and stabbing her in the neck with a small penknife which he held in the other hand. The woman, who was in a stooping position, was holding the child in one arm, and with the other she was endeavouring to ward off the blows inflicted by her husband. The young man Ferris then came in, and with his assistance, Kelly managed to wrest the knife from the man's hand and liberated the woman, who at once went out the back. It was then noticed that blood was streaming from a ghastly cut on the man's throat. Kelly and Ferris questioned the man as to the reason for stabbing his wife, when he answered, "It's all through love." Saxby then took a handkerchief out of his pocket, and having wound it round his throat to stop the bleeding, he rushed out of the house to find his wife with the intention of finishing her, as he stated. He managed to get some yards down the street, but Kelly went after him and brought him back. By this time 2 policemen had appeared upon the scene, and the man, Saxby, and his wife were conveyed to the Melbourne hospital in a wagonette. Constables Healy and Lohman, who'd previously appeared on the scene, stated that they found Saxby on the veranda of the house with his throat cut, presenting a ghastly appearance. Having entered the house, the woman was found in the back kitchen, covered with blood, her hands being cut very much. On the way to the hospital, the man, Saxby, handed the constables a letter addressed to the coroner, dated 6th of July. The pair have been married for 3. On being admitted into the hospital, Saxby and his wife were at once attended to by Dr. Richard Saxby. It was found that the man had inflicted a deep gash in his throat under his chin and above the organs of speech, extending from ear to ear. The windpipe was partially severed, but the man was able to articulate a few incoherent sentences. The woman had sustained a gash on the back of the neck, about 2.5 inches in length, reaching down to the bone, and had also received a slight cut on the throat. The wounds inflicted on Mrs. Saxby are not very serious, and she'll probably recover. At a later hour last night, her husband was in a very critical condition, and it was considered that if inflammation set in, the case would be a hopeless one. During the evening, Saxby inquired as to how his wife was progressing, and on being told she was very bad, he regretted that he had committed this act. On the 17th of October, 1878, Jonathon Saxby was charged with wounding his wife, Mary Robina Saxby, with intent to kill her, and there was a second count of alleging to be wounding with intent to do grievous bodily harm. It appeared that the prisoner and his wife had separated some months ago, stated that Mr. Saxby went to his wife and he asked her, "You intend to leave me, do you?" And Mrs. Saxby said, "Yes, I intend to look after myself. I have been in a state of poverty long enough." The prisoner replied, "You had better prepare and say what you have got to say, for you have a very short time to say it in." And he then rushed at her. As he produced a knife and cut her neck with it, she cried out, "Oh, let me go, I'll go home with you." He said, "Will you?" She ran out of the room and called for assistance. The prosecutrix admitted that some years ago she had been married to another man, but she had not heard of him for several years before her marriage with the prisoner. Dr. Madden contended that neither of the graver charges against the prisoner were made out, and at the utmost he was guilty of maliciously wounding. The jury found the prisoner guilty on the second count of wounding and with intent to do grievous bodily harm, and he was remanded for sentence. Saxby was released on the 15th of October 1881. He was released a year earlier due to good behaviour. Mary married George Bell on the 5th of September 1887, so it seems again she committed bigamy, and she died on the 4th of June 1890 in Port Melbourne, aged only 33. Jonathon died at the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum in Hotham West on the 22nd of May 1891, aged 61, and was buried with his first wife Jane and their 4 infant children in the Melbourne General Cemetery in Carlton. So his surviving children: Jane Saxby married Michael Logan on the 1st of October 1877 when she was 18. They had 10 children. Michael died in 1900, leaving her with a 3-year-old as well as 5 other surviving children. And Jane died on the 7th of September 1918 in Footscray, aged 59, of pneumonia. The second child, Julia Saxby, married Henry Hall on the 14th of February 1906 at Port Melbourne. Julia was 43 and Henry 55. Julia had 2 children out of wedlock: Frederick Henry Saxby, known as Harry, who was born in Carlton in 1881, and Ethel Jane Saxby, born in Port Melbourne in 1885. There was no father listed on either birth certificate. And Elizabeth Louisa, she was only 12 when her father was in prison for 4 years, and she was the Lizzie referred to in the letter to the coroner. She married Charles Thomas Garrard in Sydney on the 20th of January 1883. She said she was 19 and her father a tinsmith on her marriage record. Lizzie was a servant and Charles a labourer at the time of their marriage. They had a daughter, Mary Jane, born in Port Melbourne on the 14th of February 1887. Charles worked on ships around the Australian coast. While her husband was working, Lizzie was assisted by her sister Jane when Mary Jane was born. Charles was listed as living at Port Melbourne in January 1888 and was a labourer, but by 1891 he was back working on the ships, and this time he did not return. Charles actually married Agnes Kelly in June 1897 when Agnes was 23 and Charles 35, and they had 9 children together and lived in Townsville. Possibly Mary Jane went to live with her father and stepmother when they married when she was 10, as Mary Jane married in Queensland in 1904, aged 17, and Agnes is named as her mother on her death certificate. Charles was insolvent in 1902 and he died in Queensland on the 9th of October 1923. He was hit by a bus at the age of 61. On the 12th of October 1923 in Townsville it says, Charles Gerard, aged 62, a stevedore in the employ of Howard Smith, was knocked over by a motor bus in Flinders Street West on Tuesday afternoon and died in hospital. The bus driver was charged. So after Charles left, Lizzie commenced a relationship with William Clow around 1891. They had a son William in 1892, but on the 3rd of October 1892, William became a ward of the state. Lizzie was living in Yarraville at the time, and William died on the 25th of January 1893. Lizzie then gave birth to Elizabeth Lilia Saxby, who was born in Carlton in 1893, no father listed. She's listed as Lily Saxby when she died in East Hotham at the age of 3 months in 1894. And then on the 23rd of August 1898, Lizzie married John Thomas Rourke, a polisher in Fitzroy. They had 3 boys, 2 surviving infancy. Lizzie was a nurse at this time, and she died on the 12th of January 1920 in Footscray, aged 53. There were some family trees that said that Jonathon Saxby's older brother James was a convict sent to Van Diemen's Land. James was born in Harwich, Essex, England on the 12th of February 1828, and there is a James Saxby who was convicted of stealing a watch and tried at Harwich in 1848, and it's stated that he was married. He was tried at Chelmsford on the 13th of July 1848, transported to Van Diemen's Land on the 3rd of October 1850 on the Nile, and he was sent to Impression Bay Probation Station, where he was disciplined several times for abusive language, drunkenness, disorderly behaviour and similar unruliness, before being admitted to hospital and dying on the 24th of October 1854. The coincidence of the name and location of his arrest are tempting, and the detailed physical description does closely match that of Richard Saxby. 5'3.5", oval face, brown hair and thick nose. But the convict's age is wrong. The convict here is 33. The other question is his occupation. This convict was a tailor, not a sailor. In 1857, Jonathon and James Saxby's mother was ill and she died of paralysis and exhaustion, presumably due to a stroke, on the 1st of August 1857. By this time, Jonathon would have been in Australia for some time. On the occasion of his wife's death, Isaac Saxby wrote a will. Later that year, he added a codicil, believing his son James was dead, and concluded that James's brother John was also dead. In 1859, Jonathon placed a missing friends column in the Melbourne Argus. Richard Saxby, formerly of the Schomburg, can hear from his brother James at 172 Little Lonsdale Street West. Richard seems to have believed his brother was still alive, and it appeared on the 2nd of August edition. James Saxby, call Mr. Rowan's store off Stoke Street, Sandridge, you will find your brother. It seems Jonathon preferred taking on the name Richard, even though on formal certificates he is Jonathon Richard Saxby. So in the end, a very interesting story on J.R. Saxby, and I will add his prison photo onto the Facebook page so you can see what this man indeed looked like. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.